Today we are gathered for the 5th interview of our podcast Desporto, Vivido, Desporto, Pensado, an initiative by the Permanent Seminar of Sport Philosophy put together by me, Luís Ávila Costa, alongside with Constantino Pereira Martins. This podcast aims to bridge the gap between the more practical, lived side of sports and these theoretical aspects related to research and reflection. It's a space for celebrating individuals and unique lives and experiences, blending theory, know-how, and practical application. We've got Jesús Ilundáin-Agurruza here with us today, professor and chair of the philosophy department at Linfield University, who we consider as one of the most relevant players in the philosophy of sport, especially in the role he has always played in welcoming everyone, but particularly Spanish and Portuguese researchers, into the international community of philosophy of sport. Jesus' contributions to the sports philosophy field cover a wide range of topics, delving into aesthetics, excellence, traditional sports, cycling, sailing, diving, the role of sport in philosophy and in a good life. His thought-provoking and creative writings have played a very relevant role in the philosophy of sport community. Jesus, thanks for having us and agreeing to do this interview. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be with you, Luisa and Constantino. And I'm on the back of the conference you put together yesterday on religion and philosophy. I'm really excited to share some ideas and have a good discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. So the first general question we would like to make is, how did you become interested in the philosophy of sport?
That goes back a long time, and it goes back to a picture and a little description when I was 10 years old. And it was a book of history and geography. And it said that in ancient Greece, they had the idea, of course it's mistaken, it's from Rome, but that mens sana in corpore sano, from Juvenal, right? And I read that not knowing any better. I thought, wow, that makes a lot of sense to me, that you need to have a healthy mind and a sound body to kind of live a better life. And at the time I was already, my father used to play football professionally, and then they played, my mother and my father, a lot of tennis on a high level. So I was already very keen on the physical. But also I was moved by, I was a curious little kid, so to me it made sense to try to blend those, and I guess subconsciously that stuck with me. And as I went through, I had two passions. In Spain we studied philosophy in high school. So when I started with that class, it kind of was like a perfect match. It made so much sense to think philosophically. But also I was really keen into, I was a swimmer at the time, and I wanted to be maybe a coach or something like that. And well, how could I blend two of them? And long story short, I ended up going to the United States to study, and there I found out that I could actually study both at the same time. Because in Spain I had to choose, and then they told me, well, if you want to become a philosopher, you'll be hungry and homeless. So okay, maybe I'll try to do a sport instead. It's a better life with that. And then, I didn't have to choose, so that was, ever since then, it was kind of like one path.
As we could notice in the last conference of the International Association for the Philosophy of Sport in Split, the original question of how we can define sport remains prevailing and up to date. They keep discussing it.
Yes.
Endless.
That's what philosophers do.
Yeah. How would you define sport within these countless forms of practices and meanings to which it can be experienced up to the present day? Is there any essence or identity of sport for you?
I'm going to give you a very unsatisfactory answer. I think sport, we might think there is a shift in essence to a sport. So it's one of these compromises. What I do think is that sport changes and is affected by culture. Although the role it may play may be quite, let's say, universal in terms that it's very easy to, like we saw in some of the discussions yesterday. But I think it transforms itself. So there may be some basic elements. I know people tend to think of Suits definition. And I think the insight to sport, I think in a formal way, we have the idea of inefficiencies, which I think is crucial to sports and games. And that's probably the one element. But that takes so many shapes and changes so much over time that I think it's almost like a very empty shell on which we have to really build in. And I think that the most important part is not found in the formal aspect, inefficiencies per se, but in just how those inefficiencies are expressed. And those are the ones that change and that really are embodied. So I think the idea of sport per se as an abstraction, in a Platonic sense, we have that notion, but I think to me it's not very interesting at all. Once I have that working framework, what I want to see is, well, how is the sport manifested? And how are the aesthetic and normative values and ethical values and actual performances, and how that performance is affected by the color environment. And I think that's what really gets interesting to me. So I'm very interested in the world of phenomena more than the world of ideas, as it were. Which for a philosopher is probably something I shouldn't say, at least in the West. And at the same time, I think I'm very taken by, I don't think it's either or either, and that you have to have either an abstract essence to sport and then a concrete manifestation. But I think it lives in tension, in the sense that, there's this living contradiction or tension between our ideas as philosophers. They have to be, in essence, we're talking about sport and not dance or something else to differentiate it. But I think there is very interesting overlappings too with other kinetic endeavors, whether it's dance, whether it's Shinto as a sport in Argentina maybe, or maybe as religion in Japan, like we saw yesterday in that presentation, right? And I think it's in those liminal spaces that it gets really interesting for us as philosophers, anthropologists, or thinkers, that we get to find out what they mean to us. And I think that's what we're going to have both. And we have a driving direction between the ideal of, I guess, these inefficiencies we cultivate, and the notion of, well, how are these manifested in our lives, I think.
To deal with this definition of sport is being critical for the academic environment, because we have a lot of different universities that dedicate their study to sport. So to define an object of study is important to justify their existence. So the pedagogy of sport, physical education, coaching, training, and the education of sport professionals in general have been affirmed over the years as a central philosophical issue. However, the various universities and schools of thought dedicated to sports in Portugal, and we assume in the rest of the world as well, maybe, have adopted different terminologies for our object of study, encompassing concepts like sport, physical activity, physical exercise, physical education, human movement, human motricity, kinesiology, and more. What do you think about this diversity of concepts that define our object of study, and what these terms mean to you, and how do you think we should name our faculties and define our object of study? This question is important for us because in our history we move from different concepts. When we try to affirm sports as a field, an academic, scientific field, we have this need of naming it sports sciences, to affirm it like a science. Physical education sciences, sports sciences. But a medical school is not medical sciences school, it's medical school. But then in the South they choose human motricity because they found sports is a really closed concept, and they wanted to open to different sporting activities, but different from sport, like dance or other fields. So what do you think about this diversity, and how should we name our faculties, our universities?
If you're looking for a short, catchy name, I think that's very difficult to come up on the spot. So let me think through it and see what comes at the end. I think in Europe, in probably traditional, coming from Germany and other places, there's a need to talk about Wissenschaft of science, because it has more credence, or but there is a joke among scientists, which is that the moment you have to put science to a science, it's not real science anymore, right? So that's a problem already, right there. You have physics, you have chemistry, but you have material science. Well, they say, well, that's not real science. They are using our concepts or our methodologies to talk about something else, or investigate something else. So I think we're talking about marketing here. And that's the world we live in. How do you make something actually appealing that's going to bring you students and funding and etc.? Or else we can be talking about, do we want to describe what we do actually and what we study? And that's a choice we have to make, I guess. The idea would be a compromise where you find good marketing with describes best, most aptly, what is it that you're doing. And somebody can tag on the word science or motricity to it and give it a particular take. And I think to some extent, those are labels that are useful for those who are new to the discipline. So we have to think first, who's our audience? Who do we want to, is it describing us to ourselves, what we do? Or is it describing this to outsiders? Or maybe both, and I'm not sure, what is it that you might need? Or is it to administrators who are trying to justify something to somebody else? That said, right, I think the essence of what we do is movement, whether it's dance, whether it's sports in terms of traditional athletic competitions, whether it's something like martial arts. So I think I would like to do something having to do with the idea of movement. And of course, we think, well, how about kinesiology, kinesthetics, kinetics, blah, blah, because kine is movement in Greek. You can go that route as well. But again, now we are making something that's more academic. If you want to appeal to a broader general public, I think the idea of movement, movimiento, is more important. So if you could actually think of ways to navigate that, you could speak of, the arts and sciences of movement, of movement, arts and sciences. Or of course, well, but that's a capture physical education. Well, you can think of pedagogy. You can actually think of movement studies. And from it, you can have an umbrella of just like, for example, they do in some of the, health departments. You have medicine, you have different schools, but they all have an overarching framework with health. We also connect with health. And then in some of the work I do, I also do a lot of work with human cognition. So there's neuroscience, there is, so I guess the problem is that, not a problem, it's a problem for how to categorize it and label it. It's a boon, or it's an advantage in the fact that it's growing so much from what used to be something that was very focused on physical education or physical, the word physical is something I don't like actually. It's very, very reductive and dualistic. That's why I haven't mentioned it, by the way, because it puts again the physical with the mind. And I think, as you know from everything I've written, I think that the best way to think of them is together and try to do integration. And I think movement solves that problem in the sense that you don't have to talk about, of course, we move with our bodies, but how are they animated? Animation, going back to Aristotle, is a concept that's very rich. It's the idea of maybe this psyche that, and energeia, this in Chinese,
animal
key.
soul. Animal
soul, you go to Chinese East Asian traditions, you have ki. So that's why I think the notion of movement is something I found also in my studies on East Asian culture. They also speak of movement in ways that are slightly resonant with ours. We have pneuma in Greek to speak of this energy that goes to breathing. They have ki or chi in China and Japan. And I think what I always look for is how to make connections and build bridges to understand things better. And so I guess I don't have a satisfactory answer to you. I guess for administrators, they're going to look for something that can justify your existence in terms of what's the paradigm right now. Well, the science is as usual, right? We have these STEM programs and it's kind of that they're going everywhere, and humanities are trying to survive everywhere. I see, closing programs in religion or humanities, trying to or bring together departments to save costs. And I think at the same time, we've seen these cycles already in the past in universities or in education where there is a fashion, there is a way to try to get students, and I can see that university has to survive. But what makes me think of something that once when I was 16, I was studying Latin in school, and the Latin professor, an old Jesuit, said, well, the world is actually moved by ideas, by principles, by beliefs, not by sciences. And at first I thought, this old guy is going gaga on me. I mean, and there was way before there was even the idea of phones or whatever, right? But we have planes, we have this and that. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized how true it was. These decisions have been based on actually maybe misguided principles and ideas as to what a good life is all about, and what a good academic environment that's going to teach everybody is all about, or what a university is. Also, I think part of the problem, and Ortega Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, also I think had to offer already back 50 years ago, which is we have university, we have technical schools, what do you want? University, universidad, universal, this is about knowledge, about giving people the free time to actually study and learn about things without having to bring something that's useful necessarily. And this connects with the sport actually, right? Ortega defines sport to some extent as superfluous exertions.
As a?
Superfluous exertions. esfuerzos superfluos, unnecessary efforts. And that's the life of the researcher. I mean, when Newton, like Ortega says, discovered calculus or Leibniz, they were not trying to find something that's going to change the scientific world. They were playing with numbers. They were enjoying exploring and finding all kinds of different dead alleys and new ones and so on. But you need to have that life of leisure, as it were. Leisure actually, it's not meant in terms of enjoyment only, but it was the idea of having the time not to have to work. And what you bring to society is something that's larger. Sometimes it brings amazing advancements through calculus. Sometimes it's different ideas that motivate us to live better lives. And I think administrations and those powers that be that make these decisions should probably have a longer range. Problem is with politicians, right? They live on 3-5 year cycles.
Yes.
My next election, my next, and some administrators, they're beholden to a system that's backwards. I mean, we need to think long range into decades or even further up. Okay, what kind of life do we want to see in 40, 50, 60 years so that we don't end up with the problems we have nowadays for lack of foresight, right? And I think it all begins maybe with think of it about labeling things in the proper way. Think, well, do we want to make it a narrow thing that is actually fashionable? Do we want something that's not more universal, that's going to be adaptable and flexible?
Sorry to be picky, but I have
please.
here a problem or a tension.
Yeah.
How can a sports university or sports faculty justify if its name is movement, human movement faculty? How can it justify not admit music students? Because it's also human movement, and also how there's something closer between martial arts, capoeira, or dance and sports. Their proximity there, than with music, playing an instrument. So my problem with the movement concept is this, because there's a lot of human movements, and the sporting spirit that is inside this specific human movement is different from the musical movement or the more practical movements like eating an apple or so I know I'm being picky, but how is there any space in the middle between the larger concept of movement and the strict concept of sport? Is it possible to search for something like this in the middle of these kind of polarized concepts?
Okay.
I don't know if I was clear.
No, you're clear. It's a good question. It's difficult. That's why I'm pausing to think before I try spouting out. I take your point that movement may be too general, too broad. That said, I think, like you say, we can move in an apple with microphones, we can get better hearing, turn our heads. We don't want to say that any movement is going to qualify as worthy of study and spend years on. And also we want to, like you said, draw some boundaries between disciplines which are similar or not. Quite often, actually, one of the examples I use for my students to distinguish sport from dance or music in particular, I say, well, in music, we also have very skilled violin players, for example. There are competitions as well. So it's not the element of competition that drives what's in music versus sport. And here I go back to the notion of the history of sport, right, that we find, and say, well, they have different lineages. It goes back to where they get started. And I think same thing with martial arts, and we find closer, mappings, and something happens in art as well. The argument that goes back to, well, what is art, or what is going to count as art versus not art, is based on the history of the practice. So I'll get to how to maybe delimit that as I think through it, but one basic difference between dance and music and sport is that they have very different, through overtime, they have found different ways of manifesting themselves, which are disparate, obviously. And I think in regard with music, right, it comes back to the idea of inefficiencies. Musicians don't tie a hand to their back to play things in a more difficult way and make it more interesting. And sports people do that. Martial arts is a tougher case because in martial arts you want to be efficient in what you try to do. You don't want to try to fight somebody with the tie back to your hand unless it's too easy or for good practice or because you're just so damn good or whatever, right? But that's not the name of the game, right? So I think this is more like a continuum. And I don't see anything wrong with trying to say, well, could musical competitions be pseudo sporting events? Well, I think will happen with e-games as well, or the virtual thing. Are they real sports or no? We have people like Perry saying, well, because things don't happen in the real world, it's virtual, that the actual playing of the game, it doesn't count as a sport, like a Olympic-style sport. And I think part of it, when we're discussing these things, is we have this notion of sports also is kind of narrow. We have this notion of the Olympic-style sports, and that's what constitutes sport. But we have many other activities, we say, is it exercise, or is this like somebody goes swimming in the ocean? How similar difference are from Olympic swimming in a swimming pool, where you're doing laps and counting and timing somebody? Of course, there are races in the ocean. The same activity, given the cultural context, can be either Olympic-style sport, competitive sport, it could be just literally sport or something else. It could be a quest to, who knows, right? It could be exercising spirituality, like Ivo was saying yesterday. Now, to go back to the original question, as I think through this, there is always the possibility of adding small tags to narrow the field. So it could be movement studies, and then put something else to it. I'm not sure what it could be, depending on what your needs are, or what kind of affiliated faculties are you going to have in this regard under your umbrella. Science and humanities, right? Don't mention the arts then. Of course, we have these martial arts or things like dance, because dance is an art, but it's very close to sport. But then again, the faculty of dance usually is somewhere else, unless I was just in a conference on embodied dance and embodied cognition on dance. And there was an overlap there, but you could see there were academic distinctions that become erased. That's the funny thing when you actually start talking about things and you see all the connections. But for the sake of organization and in the real practical world, right, I think part of the solution is maybe, well, don't mention the arts in part of your labeling. And of course, one move is still too vague, but you say kinesiology, how is that any less vague? That's just movement in Greek with the logos put to it, science of movement. So I say, well, we can play that game if you want, but still the same problem arises. How is music not part of kinesiology? Because it's movement as well. So I don't see it as a problem as much as maybe gives you actually the flexibility maybe just to look at to kind of do a little wu-wei here, or Asian flexible thinking. That flexibility and that vagueness actually could be a positive side, because at some point you may want to have the music part be part of your endeavor, particularly in tough times, and find creative ways to actually say, well, although sport is not music per se, are there ways in which you can actually find very rich ways to connect, just like with the religion and sport in the conference. Like Ivo yesterday, right, had this very nice phenomenal versus phenomenological distinction between sport and religion. It made a lot of sense. Well, you can see similar with martial arts or dance or music or sport, that they are, again, because they have different histories, and I think also formally speaking, we have the idea of superfluous inefficiencies. But is that enough to say, okay, I'm going to put here a big wall and please don't come in here? Or do you want to welcome them? And say, let me work with you when it's useful or not? That doesn't mean that academically I'm going to actually have you in one department, because then it becomes a mishmash. I agree with that. But that said, I think those boundaries, are found more by academics, and we create our own problems, I think, than outsiders. You talk to everybody, people out there, it would make sense to them, movement, and they'll see, sport is different music, but what can I find together? It's usually those practical elements that I think, and that's why I bristle against it. I'm kind of, one of my colleagues says that she's an institutional atheist. And I'm very much struggling with my institution, but I think institutions like McIntyre says, there's a lot to watch out for, not simply because of the instrumentalization of money and power. My concern is more they also instrumentalize ideas in the wrong kind of way. Because they have narrow focus, they create problems for everybody else. I know they have their own issues to handle, but I think in this regard, and my worry is, I guess, if in trying to play their game is to our loss. We're trying to play their game on their terms. And I think we need to redefine those terms, so that we're not caught in these games of, well, I don't want to be seen or coupled with that. Is the worry that you're going to join the departments and you lose people and disappear and ideas, or is the worry that, I don't want you to come to my turf, you're threatening my ideas and my independence as a thinker. I think, like I like to say, fear is probably the worst advisor we can have for all kinds of situations, because it makes you react instead of acting in a wise way, I think. And I think it's better to pause and even, why is it that something worries me? And how can I work with it? When you first saw me, you saw this shark tooth in this pendant. Yeah. And I told you I liked sharks since I was a little kid. And why I like sharks is because when I was 8 years old, I saw the movie Jaws, Tiburon. Yes. And I was terrified. I couldn't even go. I was a swimmer, and it's a problem, because I would go to a swimming pool and I saw these huge sharks trying to eat me all the time. And it was, oh my. So, and then, I say, well, I have an option. I have two choices, then I realized. I can either never get in the water again, but I love the ocean, but I would go into the ocean and I would just be looking underneath. Or so what I started to do, I started learning everything I could about sharks. And then I learned, actually, it's my favorite animal. Anytime I can get a chance to swim or dive with them, I go and do that. Because I realized there is a lot of hype and fear. Of course, you have to respect them. But this knowledge actually allowed me to actually open a whole new world for me of enjoyment, of learning, of sharing things. And I think in this regard, if you confront the fear and see what is it that's really worrying you about these labeling and categorizing elements, I think, there are opportunities there. Maybe actually confront it. Say, and the battle to be fought with that maybe is actually making people realize movement has many different meanings, and we need to be specific at certain times. Maybe when it comes down to, organizing a faculty, or trying to go to a congress, or trying to get funding. At the same time, I think we want to simply welcome these vague boundaries, because that's what actually makes for creative connections.
Can I just add
please.
something here? Yeah,
of course.
You were speaking, and I was thinking that's probably just it. We're victims of our own prejudice. We're victims of our own fears, and maybe we're just lacking to the addressing radical interpretations of sports regarding complexity and multiplicity. And those are not weaknesses; those are richness. And I know you love martial arts also.
Yes.
And for example, capoeira. Is it a fight? Yes. Is it a dance? Yes, it's a dance. So it's a dance in philosophical, logical, Aristotelian terms. So it's a contradiction. Is it dance or is it fighting? Is it both? They can't be both. No, yes, it can't be both. It is both. So it's a contradiction. Yes, it is a contradiction. But it's false. No, it's richer. Right?
Yeah.
It's like, but also, let me just say, and also I was remember what you said yesterday in your keynote speech. Maybe the argument could be presented in the opposite term. Like when you're in a fight or in a war and you lose a leg, there's a phenomenon that's very well studied in medicine and psychology and everything, that it's the phantom limb.
Yes.
So we can think about it in the negative terms, like you were presented with Michael Phelps. We're not space monkeys. We're not just, athletes are not just pushing buttons to get 1 microsecond more and get a golden medal. That's not sports. That's a space monkey. It's like you said, right? Michael Phelps, oh my God, world champion, Olympic champion. He gets out of the pool, who am I? Those are philosophical questions in a negative term, right?
Yeah.
So when the example you gave of Michael Phelps, when he stops, if you take all the thinking, all the humanities, all the problematizations, all the multiplicity, all the complexity, what is left? Space monkeys, right? So what are we blocked? Capoeira. Is it a dance? Is it a fight? Oh, I don't know. Well, not knowing something is not the end of something. It's the beginning of something, right?
Yeah, actually, of course, I'm going to say I agree with you. But you missed just a couple of points quickly, and maybe you can see if you have more questions. But think of Muay Thai in terms of music and competition. In a Muay Thai combat, it's actually synchronized with the music. As they're fighting, there's music in the background, and it gets faster and faster as the combat gets more and more intense. So in these cases, I'm trying to say that music can also be an inherent part of competitive sport. Because Muay Thai nowadays is also it's a martial art, but now the way it's performed is not fighting, opponents in the battlefield. They do contests, very much like in judo and other things like that. But in this case, the music is an integral part of the fighting content and contest. So I'm saying that there are points in which you can go through ritualization, you can find this. And if you start to separate them too much as well, yeah, we have this part, we have the music, but that's part of the problem. That's reductionism that I was talking about. That starts to, of course, trying to isolate and separate things, analyze is important. But Socrates says, through Plato, through Socrates rather, right, in the Phaedrus, that what he wants to see is the kind of philosopher who can bring together synthesis and analysis together. So we need to actually separate things, analyze things as a philosopher does. But then we need to bring them together. We tend to forget that. So we see the difference between sport and music and other aspects of martial arts, etc., and dance. But then we tend to forget what is it that brings them together as well. And I think in this regard, what I was mentioning to Nietzsche as a Japanese philosopher, who speaks of the unity of contradictories. In the West, we have this paradigm from Aristotle, right? The excluded middle. You cannot have a contradiction. A and not A is impossible. I mean, that's just bad logic, bad philosophy, throw out the window. In the East, they have this sensitivity to bring those two together. It's no, don't get rid of them. It's not simply like a Hegelian thesis and antithesis, and then you have, the synthesis, because that really solves the issue. It's actually, you want to have that tension I was alluding to before, but keep it alive, as it were. Because in that push it back and forth, that's where you're going to find the actual real deep insights. And I think that's what I'm always trying to find that, and that's why maybe I'm like, it says, well, it's a contradiction. Yeah, it's probably a lot of contradictions in the Western sense. But I want to stay there because that's why I find myself navigating very interesting waters where I see all these possibilities. I can sometimes go and make a concession. Of course, this is different in this way. Like I mentioned, from music to a sport, right, with inefficiencies. At the same time, when they're settled, there's no more digging into it. We could, and we can do that, and we can spend 40, 50, 60 years trying to define sport with the same terms, once we kind of agree, basically, and then, or else we can actually strike and start exploring more interesting waters. And I think that's what also Constantino is trying to allude here. But you have to be willing to be very flexible philosophically. Also, one more thing here, in Japanese philosophy, they do something by, instead of trying to argue by, let's just say, I'm going to show you who's best here and I'm going to shut you down and this is the way to go. They are arguing about relegation. So you don't try to simply say who's on top like we tend to do in sports, zero-sum competition. Simply they try to actually say, well, your ideas are very good, but let me show you how they're part of my ideas. So I need to make some synthesis or make some analysis and make some concessions. But as you go through it, I realize that, well, in my bigger view can incorporate yours. And it's enriched by your views. But mine is better. It's not right or wrong, however, right? This is something that goes back to, again, something I mentioned very, very much in passing when I spoke the other day. We have improvement or success, conditions of success or improvement. Conditions of success are like, tests, pass or fail. With sports, right? Or with tests we do. But improvement is actually something that's much more flexible and it gives you many more options. In success, either you fail or you succeed. That's it. It's in a way very poor, although it can lead to a lot of interesting games. But improvement is something that always allows you to actually, and I think it's dynamic in the sense that you can actually worsen as well your performance or your understanding sometimes. But it's something that's dynamic, and I think it's much more profitable, as it were. Yeah.
You've wrote significant works on excellence. And the concept of excellence is something I have trouble in deal with because I'm able to practice a lot of sports, for example, a lot of musical instruments, but I'm not excellent in any of them. And on the other side, I really enjoy them all. And you've wrote significant works on excellence, but also on aesthetics of sport. And thinking in, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Kant that distinguished the interest and uninterested dimension of the aesthetic experience and the
disinterested.
So it seems to me that excellence is more interested and aesthetics is more disinterested. How these two concepts connect to each other, and why this path? Because a lot of the narratives in sports are focused on excellence. Since the Industrial Revolution and the wars with performance, and how do you connect these both dimensions of your research and your worries?
Excellent question, Luisa. Thank you. Part of the problem, I think, is, if there's a problem, is that excellence, again, has been co-opted by certain views which I think are mistaken. Excellence is not this understood, at least the way I see it, in a perfectionist sense, or it's an absolute sense of perfection. So therefore, because you, Luisa, do not have a world record to your credit in whatever you do, that makes you mediocre. And, well, I still enjoy it, but and there's no excellence there. That's one way to think about it, right? And I think there's a place to that in cutthroat competition, which I think is a problem, a sign of the times. Ortega speaks of a personal excellence. And Russo says, well, what he means by that is, well, you should actually try to see what's the best you can offer to yourself. For some person will be actually world-class performances, and anything less than that should be disappointing and not excellent. So let's suppose you have the capabilities to actually go faster than Phelps, but you lack commitment, discipline, and you're happy just being maybe national champion or the best kid in the block. Well, you're not excellent, even if you're the best all around you, because to yourself you're failing to what you're capable of doing. Somebody else may be actually, handicapped in different ways, but they are actually maxing out in terms of what it is they can do. So I think in that case, we can think of a personal excellence. Going back to interest or disinterest goes back to ideas of what's intrinsic or autotelic or not in this regard. That gets really complicated. I like to think in terms of instrumentality and instrumentality, because it's not as much tended by ideas of subjective elements like, intrinsic interest, it refers to your interests. It becomes very subjective. Instrumentalization or not covers conceptual, similar ground, but I think is a little clearer in this regard and less problematic. So when it comes down to, is excellence something that's interested or disinterested? In the way we use excellence in an absolute and perfectionist sense, we are making it a kind of an interested or instrumentalized element, whether it's performative or even aesthetic, if you will. Gymnastics is very aesthetic, but at the point we're trying to give it a 9.834 over 9.82. Okay, well, sure. And that's a game we play, but that's very interesting. But I think beyond that, right, you want to look at the sheer aesthetic aspect of it. I would think that gymnastics becomes beautiful not because of the numbers associated with it, but because of the beauty that's inherent in it, and that becomes more disinterested. And I think there's a way to find that non-instrumentalization in our activities, and if we think of it in that way, it's not an either-or, again. I don't like this either. Either-ors are useful to kind of give you the conceptual boundaries, but again, I want to go back into the middle part of it. What is it that we find between these two? So is interest disinterested? Is it excellent or not excellent? Well, let's go into it. And there's a context in which it would make sense to speak of excellence in a perfectionist for a few years, too. Again, going back to Phelps, right? He was the best swimmer ever for 10 years, the most medal Olympic athlete in the history of modern Olympics. But then that lasted, let's say, 15 years. I don't care how long. That's it. Now he's history, as it were. Where is his excellence? He was only a swimmer in a swimming pool as a human being. And not that we have to, but it made a sense at some point in which, his identity was mostly as a swimmer. And there's nothing wrong with that. You are fully dedicated to that, as long as you understand why, which is what he lacked at this point. Nobody gave him the tool to think about it. So he was simply covering a machine. Right? And it goes back to, this notion of excellence. Yeah, I'm excellent. I have perfected my craft as a swimmer. There is a story that I like to tell between, from in China. There's this excellent archer, who tries to show off to a master of let's call it, Taoist master for the story, for the purposes. He says, hey, look how well I can shoot my arrows. They hit the bullseye the whole time. I can split one arrow with the other one, like Robin Hood. And the other guy was completely unimpressed. So, do you know why you shoot arrows? And the guy's like, complete baffled, because he's asking a different question. Are you shooting arrows to impress me? To impress yourself? Is your worth as a person in those arrows? He says, I don't know. He says, well, go back, and when you have an answer, come back and tell me. A number of years go back. This is, of course, it's in China. Nothing happens quickly. And of course, this is a tough question. Like, he comes back and says, I got it. I know why I shoot arrows. And the master says, well, then, keep it to yourself and don't forget it. Because why? He doesn't want to hear it. He comes so proud to tell him. He says, why? That answer is your answer for you only. Why is important to you? What would I care? If you are trying to answer my questions, you're still barking up the wrong tree and you need to go back to your room, right? So my point being is why we tend to ask these big framework questions and with answers in a narrow sense, you know? And I think that's problematic again. And they're useful again for particular times. Phelps as Olympian. Well, it makes sense in the particular context of how we play the game, both politically in terms of world championships, Olympics, etc. But then we want to go into bigger aspects. And if his excellence doesn't connect to yours, there's a big mistake there in that kind of range, you know, between my personal excellence and perfectionist excellence at a given point for any time in time, which we know is very fluctuates. Nobody's going to be ever the best forever.
And that confusion between perfection and excellence is also very, I think, rooted in the present ideology of maximization, instrumentation. Even in terms of academia and university, you can see from the history of thought, the derivation of psychology and all the concepts that they stolen or derivated from philosophy. They borrowed from philosophy. You can see that there's a certain fear of the emptiness, as you said, very different between the West and the East. I'm also a very deep lover of the culture from the East. And in the East, the gap, even in breathing or the emptiness, it's not fearful. It's we're drawn to the things that we are missing, and here we're panicking, in a sense of that maximization. What happens when an athlete fails? He goes straight to the established psychology of sports to get them tools, to get them fixed quickly, to get back on the horse, and that's not how things work. We need time. We need time to digest. The cows need time to ruminate. It's a process, and I think the Eastern philosophy, that we both share this love for the Eastern philosophy, and the Eastern culture, they have a different perception of time, and what time brings. It's a process. It's a path. It's not like what do you call it? Those immediate juices. You get water and you put the powder and you mix it and it's orange juice. This is not how it works in sports or in life in general, right?
Yeah.
So it's like an obsession with perfection. That has nothing to do with arete or excellence. Excellence is it's a way, right?
Yeah. I think I'll close up because you probably want to move to the next question. But you know, I think there is one thing. We are data driven, obsessed with numbers now, quantification. Like Gottman said, right? We see how sport has changed over the centuries. And has become now a matter of how many watts can you push, or your heart rates, or all these kinds of metrics. And they're very useful in our context. The problem is when that becomes the paradigm to define what excellence is, or what is somebody as a sports person or not. And I think, again, there is a role for that. And I played for a number of years when I was competitive racing in cycling. I was obsessed with numbers, and then one day I realized, this is terrible, screw it. And then I threw away my cycle computer, and I was a lot happier after that. Probably faster too, but the point being here, right, is we can play that game, but that shouldn't be driving us. You know, I'm trying to learn Japanese, and there's this thing, Duolingo, that has all these little perks and numbers and whatever. And sometimes I'm very easy to get caught up in the numbers things. I've always been, I'm very obsessed with doing things, I'm pushing myself in the wrong way probably most of the time. But in a race, what I want to learn is about learning Japanese or getting more numbers and more days in a row or whatever. Well, we have to think about what is this about. Is it the numbers about swimming or running in the best way? And I think they're better. Not that it's exclusive, you can use them, but that is the tool. The numbers are the tool. You're not the number. But the problem is we're actually becoming tools to the numbers ourselves. And that is the case backward, push the horse in front of the cart.
As a Spanish citizen from Southern Europe who has lived and worked for a large part of his life in the United States, what are the main cultural tensions you felt, and what role do culture and language play in philosophical thought? Maybe I can make the next question because I think they are related.
Please.
As a Spanish who entered the Anglo-Saxon world very earlier, can you share your thoughts on continental versus analytical philosophy, and also on something that a speaker yesterday told us, also on reasonable truth and poetic truth?
Oh, thanks for easy questions. Yeah. Although I started to study philosophy in earnest in the United States in English. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't know I started in high school with philosophy in Spain. So it gave me a basic appreciation for the craft, as it were. However, sophomoric it might be. But going back to the distinctions, right? I know at the time when I was in the United States, it was a time where analytic philosophy was still very prevalent. Where it's all about analysis and so on. And some of my mentors, they were trained as analytic philosophers. So in a way, I've always thought of analytic philosophy as going to the gym and lifting weights. I think it's very useful, and it gets you stronger, sharper in different ways. But then I also had an appreciation for deeper cultural elements. I mean, I grew up loving novels and poetry and reading a lot, so I would balance that on my own by reading a lot of anything that was interesting across different traditions. And I think there's this artistic, poetic way of thinking, and there's this scientific way of thinking. We tend to separate them, right? The idea of the two cultures from smell, right? That they're separate. I think again about building bridges. So when I went to graduate school, I actually looked for all the graduate programs in the United States who had both analytic and continental philosophy, and there were only 2 in the whole country. There were a few continental programs. Most of them were analytic, and there were a couple of them. One of them was in Champaign-Urbana, and that's why I went there, because I could actually work and learn from both traditions. There's analysis and there's the cultural depth you acquire from continental philosophy, and I think both have a lot of good insights to provide. But at the same time, not to say that analysis is simply going to the gym. There's the danger on the other side of being too caught up in, let's just say, flowery thinking, where you become too enamored with your own words and they play with the words, and you play with them, and eventually it's not play with words as well, just like the analytic ones there is a complaint about. So I think that it's good to balance both of them. And navigating that, could you read me the last part of the question? So the second one.
The second one is a Spanish who entered the Anglo-Saxon world very earlier. Can you share your thoughts? You
the poetic part. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So
the poetic truth.
I think I didn't see it so much as a struggle, because I was lucky enough to work with both traditions. I do see that, and also when I first came into the discipline, JPS, the philosophy of sport, was still quite analytic. And then Mike Manami brought sport ethics and philosophy, which is a little more Catholic, if you will, in the sense of welcoming to other traditions. And I think that was a good influence. They balance each other well, and now there have been some changes as well, in which they both become, particularly JPS, a little more open to other traditions as well. So I think, again, it's not so much about cutting boundaries, but keeping your identity as you actually become comfortable enough to meet many other people. It doesn't mean I have to lose who I am in trying to get to know you, or reveal who I am and who you are, right? But if we play the game of trying to this shell, I think, of who I am versus you, academically speaking, analytic versus continental, I think, again, you are your own worst enemy. You narrow down your intellectual and cultural possibility perspective. In philosophy, I'm a perspectivist, much like Ortega, Nietzsche, or Chuang-Tzu in China. I think that truth is a composite, if you will, of different views, that we never have the whole truth. There is no God truth, I think, out there. However, we can have better and worse perspectives, and we can have better ways to look at this complex thing we call reality. And in this case, why not try to go and see things from your perspective a little bit? What can I learn from this, and from this one, and from that one? And if you look at my progression academically, in a way, it's a mishmash of things from many different traditions, Eastern, Western, and so on. So the worst question people can ask me is something that Javi Lopez Frias once asked me, well, what is your favorite philosopher or tradition? And I hate those favorite questions. What's your favorite? Because every time I say, okay, well, it's just too much good stuff out there for me to pick one thing. And what's today my favorite is going to change by tomorrow, probably, as I get exposed to different things or whatever. So to me, I always ask, my answer is, well, what is the question you have, or I need to answer? And then I tell who I'm going to be working with intellectually. It could be less philosophy and more arts, maybe, or the way around. So to me, it's what is the problem? So I just want to have a hammer in my hand and try to use for everything. Sometimes I need to have a screwdriver. Sometimes I need to have a hammer. Sometimes I have a little saw. So let me see what's in my toolkit. And if I don't have that in my toolkit, maybe I'll go to Constantino. Hey, I don't know enough about this, but what do you know about this? Please tell me. And that's the great idea of collaborating with other people and so on. And so my point is, again, going back to this, poetic thinking, analytic thinking. We need to use both. It doesn't mean you have to do everything yourself either. And that's why you have rich departments, like going back to your original question, which you can actually have, fluid boundaries, so you can actually pull from each other's expertise.
Yeah, I'm going to finish. One thing that fascinates me in you and your writings is the diversity of topics. You wrote on cycling, sailing, diving. How does a philosopher make the path between Pamplona bull runs to Buddhism and e-sport culture?
Well, you could say there is a crazy element to all of it, if you will, in the sense of striking out there and see what happens, taking risks, being a bit adventurous, both intellectually or existentially, right? I guess something that is part of my temperament. Ortega Gasset, I guess he's one of my reference points, but he's not my favorite philosopher. He's one of those, but it's that, we have physical temperaments, just as also William James said, right? And I think to some extent that not that it defines us, but it guides us. In my case, I had this wanderlust, both in terms of getting to see the world, how big it is, but also see the world of ideas in all these rich, manifestations. In this regard, right, I'm thinking sometimes the things that are closest to you, those are the ones that you're going to study first and try to understand. So when I was a young man, I loved running with the bulls but then I said, well, why the hell am I doing this? Just like the guy who's shooting the arrows. I had my own question. And the best thing I could do, well, maybe I should write about it. So that was the first article published, Mike Manami, on running the bulls and phenomenology. I didn't know much about phenomenology, but that's what I was doing actually. I was just Nietzsche, Sartre, Heidegger, Ortega Gasset to try to understand what the reign of the bulls is. After going through other explanations from psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, and journalists, and everybody else, see, all of them don't quite get it. There's something that's going on here that makes these people want to do this, men and young women, older ones. What is it about it that's so powerful? And what is it that makes it tick? And then, I used different tools I had at that time. And then as I would progress, I realized, well, there are other bigger questions about other things that I can try to understand. You and I wrote something on sailing. I'm presented on that, because, again, it's a beautiful world out there, and I love being in the ocean, the wind, and the water. But what is it about it that makes it actually so powerful? And then, I was doing a lot of pragmatism at the time. I thought it was very useful to think of it in terms of pragmatism with John Dewey and, experience. So there's this idea of trying to match idea issue with philosophers. I was telling you, toolkit. How am I going to understand this? And sometimes you realize, wow, I really want to understand now martial arts. I also enjoy the law of swordsmanship, not fencing, but swordsmanship, whether it's Kenjutsu in Japan or actually something called now historical European martial arts with long swords and so on, which I love to do. So to understand in a deeper sense, I will have to learn about other aspects of martial arts that I don't know about. So that opens a window to talk to other people, to read, to expand, and then try to bet. And that's something, to me, theory and practice, like I was trying to say, they come together for us as philosophers of sport. You cannot simply sit on the chair and think about a sport like some philosophers of sport have done.
Yes.
You need to actually, not that you have to do it yourself, but you need to actually go at least observe, talk to them.
Yes.
Become involved in it and see what it's like to do it. So I think the phenomenology to me is essential to it as well, to try to understand sport. Yes. Because without it, it's like trying to talk about painting or what it's like to paint what you've never painted. Or even better, to go to the museum to see the paintings. And I'm going to tell you what painting is all about, like Tolstoy said. It's all about expression. That's part of it, not the whole of it. Okay, and he was an artist himself. But so my point is, again, going to that perspectivism. We'll have blind spots that we don't see. How to kind of expand on those. Some of them require myself turning my head or getting better glasses or mirrors or whatever. I could do other disciplines. Sometimes it requires other people. So in my path to try to understand better the things that I care about, that speak to my heart, is the notion of, well, I have to become more steeped into our traditions. And that's why I ended up with Buddhism in the last probably 10 years, because the more I realized I learned about it, the more I saw, wow, it has a lot of contributions to make to sport philosophy in ways that I think is not appreciated. I think Japanese people and researchers, they know of what, but many of them actually have been trained as Western philosophers. So they have the Buddhist culture that they grow up with. But likewise, they have some blind sides. And Ortega Gasset also said that, sometimes you need to have a foreigner, an outsider, to show you what's really important about your own culture, or the interesting things, because you're so used to it that you're kind of blind to it. But the new person will come asking the questions, the one who doesn't know it. And that's the name of the game for us. I mean, find out those things we don't know about and what's it going on there. So this idea of the unknown, and I think the unknown invites having to come with more philosophical, intellectual, practical skills to go out there and see what's going on.
Thank you, Jesus, for being such an interesting philosopher and such a good friend. Thank you very much for this conversation. We are very grateful for this. We hope you've enjoyed this 5th episode of the podcast Desporto, Vivido, Desporto, Pensado. And we always extend the invitation to keep following, listening, and contemplating sports with us. I don't know, Jesus, if you have last words for this talk. For the ones that are listening to us, see you in the next episode.
Well, I guess I will just say that the best example of intellectual curiosity, or intelligent curiosity, not simply intellectual, but is, you, Luisa, and Constantino, with this very podcast, and maybe whoever is listening to this, they have their own curiosities. And I think that is the name of the game, to stay engaged, fully engaged in trying to be curious and see where those questions lead you, fearlessly. And you are the best example with the questions you asked me. This openness is what's crucial to it. Instead of closing boundaries, this openness to others, to different ideas, in the spirit of joint dialogue, like you say, pushing me earlier. I think that's what makes things move. We're not the movement, and I think hope we can move in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jesus.